Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the That Was Stupid podcast. I am your host, John Seidel. So excited to have you back for another episode. And this episode is going to be, it's kind of tough, right? It's going to be dark at times. And so I just want to give you a fair warning. There's lots of talk about trauma. There's lots of talk about assault. There's lots of talk about just really deep, hard issues. But yet I think there are a lot of the issues that so many of us have gone through. And so I'm a big fan of radical vulnerability. And so we're going to be talking today to Carrie Sheffield. She grew up in a Mormon cult where her dad thought that he was a prophet and was going to be the next president of the United States. And her 8 siblings were forced to travel around and live kind of this nomadic lifestyle as he pursued that, what he called the calling, in some ways. So we're going to be talking to Carrie about her experience. She's written a new book on it called Motorhome Prophecies. And she's going to be really open and vulnerable with us about a couple that was stupid moments, or really a few. The first one being when she escaped her family. I say that was stupid because her family was like, "This is stupid. You can't do this." The second one was leaving the church that she grew up in, the Mormon faith that she had found so much stability in. And there was a lot of people that said that was stupid. And then the third would be going back and forgiving her father for a lot of the trauma and the issues that were at the center of her upbringing. There's a lot of people that would say, no, he deserves, your scorn. And so she's actually even going to talk about some of the science of forgiveness. And so I think this is important. So before we get there, just remember that That Was Stupid is brought to you by the Veritas Creative. Go to theveritascreative.com, especially maybe you have a book inside of you like Carrie does and you want to help kind of outlining that, or even just talking through it. Maybe you're a church or a nonprofit who wants to expand your digital media presence. Go to theveritascreative.com and they can help you with all of that. So with that said, let's get to Carrie. Like I said, just, not necessarily that this is a kid's show and it's not anything explicit in the terms of curse words, but there's just some deep and heavy topics. So just want to make you aware of that as we talk to right now, Carrie Sheffield. Carrie, thank you so much for joining the That Was Stupid podcast. You've been all across the country promoting your amazing book, and I am so honored that you took some time so that we could talk and chat about, what I think are kind of 2 seminal, or 3 really, That Was Stupid moments in your story that a lot of people were, kind of taken aback by. And so I'm honored that you would join us.
Thank you, John. Glad to be here.
So I'd like to start with just kind of an overview. So what do you do now when people say, all right, who is Carrie Sheffield? Like, what do you do now?
Yeah, so I spend my days both in the political policy arena, and like you mentioned, I'm now about a new book out, and that's more based in spiritual issues and mental health issues. So I'm doing that as well. So I once had a book that I read that I found interesting, and the author recommended you put your life in a Venn diagram, and she recommended 3. So my 3 verticals are media, political economy, and health and wellness. So I operate in the middle of those 3 Venn diagrams.
Which is, it's great because I'm a recovering political news veteran, as I like to say, spent years in it. And so I always respect people that were able to stay in that arena, because I was like, I can't. So I respect you a lot. You have, I think, one of the craziest stories that in some ways you're kind of like, this really goes on in America. Like, this is still going on, and it's pretty incredible. So I want to give you the floor. I didn't want to try to. I just feel like I would do it injustice. And so I would like you to kind of give us the overview of your story that's included in your new book, Motorhome Prophecies.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Yeah, and I've got a copy for those who are watching You can see the cover, Motorhome Prophecies, A Journey of Healing and Forgiveness. That's not our motorhome on the cover, but it is representative, and it kind of looks like Utah. But it's called Motorhome Prophecies because I have 7 biological siblings. And with our parents, we had all 10 of us spent large portions of my childhood living in a motorhome. And in the end, I ended up going to 17 public schools and a homeschool. Sometimes we had houses. I describe my childhood as careening between a third world and a first world existence, kind of in and out. And the reason we live this way is because my dad claimed that he was a prophet within the Mormon tradition. And I'm very careful to put the caveat that he was not sanctioned by the official Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the official LDS church. He eventually was excommunicated. And so I'm just putting that caveat to say that his behavior, in my view, was a very twisted interpretation of the theology of LDS. And he claimed that he would be a prophet someday that would become president and take, rule in the White House. And it was our job as his offspring and his wife to support him in that. And so in order to do that, he made us, move all the time. He said it was the Holy Ghost telling him to do this. So sometimes we didn't even have the motorhome. My mom gave birth to my brother when the family was living in a tent in a campground. And then when I took my ACT exam, we were living in a shed in the Ozarks with no running water and no furnace. And down there, it gets on average in the 30s during winter. So we just had to make do with some space heaters, but it was very cold and dank. And last year I went to Peru for a volunteer trip, and I walked into one of the homes there in a very poor neighborhood up in the mountains. And I was transported back to my childhood in the Ozarks. And immediately the smell and just the feeling of just like, wow, I'm here. And it was, in some ways, it influenced my trajectory of my career to be a journalist because I was used to coming in and out of many different environments. So I tried to get silver lining. But it also caused a lot of stress and trauma to be told on a daily basis that you're not worthy, that you're evil, that your sole existence is to do the will of your parent. And eventually 3 of my siblings have attempted suicide. I have been suicidal. I've been diagnosed with PTSD, depression, fibromyalgia, which I have a complicated view on that word, fibromyalgia. I think it's more another thing called tension myositis syndrome, which is John Sarno. I can talk about that for a while. But in any case, I've been in and out of the hospital multiple times for physical pain related to my anxiety. And I appreciate that you talk about anxiety because it is, I think, a very common modern phenomenon. I don't know, partially because our culture, I think, is moving more fast-paced. What's interesting is like our physical needs are so much less today than they were compared to the ancients, the agrarian societies. But at the same time, we also don't have to toil. We don't have to toil from sun up to sundown just to make a loaf of bread or, kill the cows or whatnot. Most of us. But at the same time, we also have a lot more anxiety, even though we also have a longer lifespan. And so the book wrestles a lot with these issues of mental health. I eventually had 2 brothers develop schizophrenia. One of them tried to rape me, groped me, and the other said I tried to seduce him to have sex with me. So we've just struggled with, I like to say sometimes, the diagnostic, the DSM-5 manual of diagnostics of disorders, mental disorders. We've had run-ins with, if not all, many of them.
I literally have the DSM sitting down here because
Okay.
I'm working on my next book, and I needed the DSM, so I ordered it. And boy, is that thing thick! If you don't mind, I want to take a little bit of a tangent here because and I'm not trying to stir up anything or throw anyone under the bus, but there was a prominent preacher recently that kind of came out and talked about how mental health disorders are a lie by big pharma and that kind of thing. And I wrote 2 articles about how I just think it's wrong. As someone who has experienced PTSD, because that was one of the things they said, it's just grief or whatnot. What do you say? To, especially to Christians who are struggling, where they hear something like that it's not real, and you're saying, no, it's real?
Yeah, I think that what he's saying, I mean, he's older. I believe he's in his 80s. I think there is a generational gap on that. And similarly, my father now is in his 80s, and I tried to get him into counseling because he had been sexually molested as a baby by a Mormon female babysitter when he was a toddler. And that's one of his first memories, is that molestation. And he said as an adult, it made him feel suicidal. And that is common, sadly, to see children who are sexually molested are far more likely to commit suicide and attempt suicide than children who are not. And he refused to get treatment. And he said, God will take care of me. So this is a common thing that we see, that there's this notion that you don't need mental health treatment. And I understand, in their defense, some of that reticence because, and this is my passion area, and we were talking, I just hosted an event at the Museum of the Bible where we brought in, the name of the event was called The Bible and Mental Health. And we brought in some of the top experts on neuroscience and therapy and counseling from a biblical perspective. And over, themes emerged from this gathering. You know, I had people who were practicing Christians from Harvard Medical School, Baylor College of Medicine, Catholic University, Liberty University, and the themes emerged that overall the industry is very secular. 61% of therapists are either atheist or agnostic, which shocked me when I learned this. But I was also not that surprised in the sense that that was, I know when I started therapy, I was a BYU student and my therapist was LDS. But eventually when I moved to New York, I had a therapist who was very secular and didn't understand me at all. So I can see why some Christians wouldn't have the best view of mental health treatment or counseling or therapy, given how biased it is against, or even just a lack of knowledge of how to integrate spirituality with your mental health care. So that's why I organized this gathering, because I am very passionate about these, again, science-based evidence that religion is very good for your mental health. And I think that would be the kernel that I would agree with this pastor on, that spirituality is in many respects an antidote to mental illness. However, it is not always the case. And in some cases, you do need medication. You know, some people need cholesterol medication their whole lives. Otherwise, they could, so case in point. And you understand that, John, and that's a physical trait for you, and so some people, I've been on medication a couple of different times over my life for my depression, but I was able to get off it. Fortunately, I was able to have other interventions that got me off that drug. But at the time, I was experiencing severe trauma. In one case, it was after I left the LDS church. In another case, it was when I was dealing with my hospitalizations with my fibromyalgia that I mentioned, where I was hospitalized for my, there were several different times, but one was that my sodium levels dropped to near fatal levels. And if your sodium levels drop too low, your brain swells and your skull is fixed and you die. So there were these physical problems with my brain, and the antidepressants help to rebalance the chemistry. Again, this is a physical problem.
Yes.
So some people need drugs, or I guess the word need is relative. I mean, if you want to live a longer, healthier life, then you will take this drug for the rest of your life. For a lot of people, they don't want to live that way, and they would rather be on it temporarily, as I was. And fortunately, I haven't needed it. But if I do hit another trauma, God forbid, then I wouldn't be afraid to use it if I needed to temporarily.
Yeah.
So I'm a big believer in using the tools. God gave us our brains. He gave us the ability to create medications that can save our lives. I think it's a little bit kind of like, I don't know the depths of Christian science, but, or even, I don't know, people who are Luddites who don't want technology. Some people used to fear the electric light bulb. There are reasons why they wanted to keep the old school way of thinking. There is a lot of, I think, over-medication. And so I agree with critics on that respect. I think we're way too quick to, especially for children who are just running around, to slap them with the label of ADHD or other things and then just drug them up. And so I think there needs to be a healthy balance. But overall, the science is very robust that religion is good for your mental health. There was a study that was a literature review of more than 100 studies in Psychiatric Times, and they found 90% of these studies showed a strong drop or a strong correlation between religious participation and lower substance abuse. And substance abuse is highly correlated with suicide, drug overdose, alcohol overdose. So the more religious you are, the higher you are likely to have a longer life, less suicide, and less depression. That is scientifically proven. And that's what bothers me about the atheist agnostic practitioners who don't know this and don't incorporate it, because 76% of patients seeking mental health care, this is according to a Harvard medical school study by a professor who is Jewish, devout Jewish. He's done a lot of pioneering studies in this space. He's found that 76% of patients seeking mental health care wanted spiritual care integrated into the mental health care. And yet, on the flip side, 71% of cognitive behavioral therapists, the therapists themselves, said they had little to no training in how to do that, how to integrate spirituality into the mental health care.
Yeah, I think, oh man, I knew we were aligned. I didn't realize how aligned. I mean, I call medicine in my book, Finding Rest, that I talked about faith and mental health, just about that it's a common grace, right? Like it's a common grace. The Lord has allowed us to figure, Prozac is a great thing, and I think sometimes there's a pride issue that says, God, you can help me in any way, but the way that I don't want you to help me, right? I'll run, but no way will I take medication. And so, yeah, like you said, I got high cholesterol, right? Like it's hereditary. I lost 70 pounds and I still had high cholesterol, right? So it wasn't my weight. It was like, it runs in my family. So I appreciate that. I want to get back to your story. One curiosity that I have is, tell me, how was your father convinced that he was a prophet that was going to be president?
Well, I have a whole chapter on him. It's the second chapter on my read on how it all happened. And there are several ingredients. One is the childhood trauma that he experienced. And quite often when you're dealing with this existential crisis of feeling suicidal due to that type of trauma, you really want to fill that void with trauma responses. So trauma responses, creating an alternative that gives you a sense of meaning and purpose. And I do believe that he called it the mission. That was his prophetic call. He would call it the mission. So I believe the mission was his trauma response in some respects. I also think it was his interpretation of LDS theology, which does teach in the theology that you can, if you're righteous enough as a man, become a god someday and have your own planet that you co-manage with your wife, or if you choose multiple wives. And so there's this sense of always learning and educating yourself, which I think is a good thing, because they say that whatever knowledge you take with you, you bring with you into the afterlife to help manage the planet. And so this idea that you should constantly be learning, I think that's a positive aspect of LDS culture, that it places a high priority on learning and giving back and civic participation. So there's this strong sense of civic engagement. And so my dad certainly felt that way. And that was part of the mission that he would be president, because he's got this grandiose megalomania that's based on the trauma response. And then there's also the fact that he was phenomenally talented as a musician. He was a world-class level classical guitarist. And he's at his height, he was also 6'2", blonde hair, blue eyes. His sister was Miss USA. And my photos of my dad when he was younger, I'm like, my dad kind of looked like Brad Pitt a little bit. He was good looking, very strong, and he was like a intramural wrestling champion in college. And if you know anything about classical guitar, there was a guy named Andres Segovia who was from Spain, and he was one of the greatest, if not the greatest known to date, classical guitarist. He was knighted by the King of Spain. He had 10 honorary doctorates. He had a Lifetime Grammy Achievement Award. He has an asteroid named after him. So he's like a rock star classical guitarist. And Segovia hand-selected my father to be one of his proteges.
Wow.
So that was the level of caliber that my father played on classical guitar. And my dad also won this nationwide composer contest for the best up-and-coming music writer in the entire country. And he tells the story, this would have been, I think, in like the 60s. So a while ago, we were less connected. We didn't have the internet. Utah was a lot smaller, a lot less known. He says they pull the envelope and they read, they're like, where the hell is Provo, Utah? Yeah. He put Utah on the map. So So yeah, he did. He had enormous gifting. And his father had been a politician also. His father, my grandpa, had been the Republican whip in the Utah legislature and had been a very successful attorney and land developer, real estate developer. He'd been chairman of the Zoning and Planning Commission in Salt Lake City. And in fact, this is a fun fact, if you're ever driving in Utah and you turn right at a red light, you can thank my grandpa. He wrote that law. And
Oh, there you go.
actually, it's in my grandpa's obituary that he wrote that law. So those are the ingredients together that combine exceptional gifting with mental illness and trauma, and his interpretation of the theology. And that's how it happened.
So, chapter 8 talks about the title is Escape. And so I think that's a good segue is how did you get out, right? This existence that was so, nomadic and trauma filled. How did you get out?
Yeah, well, I say in the book that sometimes life's most wrenching crucibles can lead us to our greatest moments of freedom. And for me, the most traumatizing experience, I mean, there were a bunch, but I was 17, and that was when my schizophrenic brother groped me and tried to rape me. And he's probably twice my weight, 5'2". He's like over 6 feet, I think. And he's very mentally ill. So I knew that that was not him. Like, if he was in his right mind, he wouldn't be doing that. But at the same time, like, I can't be in a close quarter with 10 people with someone like that who thinks about this with me, and he had done some scribblings in his notebook about having sex. And I'm just like, I can't. I feel at just a deep sense of fear now. And he's 7 years older, and it was a lot. And so but I also, to that point, had wanted to believe my dad. And in some respects, I had for a long time believed that he was a prophet and that the mission was real. And so
So you guys really did. You embraced that, as young children.
We did. Yeah. And in fact, we were all assigned instruments. So all 8 of us, the kids and my mom, we all played together. So to begin with, the way it started out, the mission was that my dad would play his beautiful guitar music on street corners and pass out brochures trying to convert people to be Mormon. And that was the mission, was to and it wasn't just LDS theology in these brochures. He had Bible quotes. He had quotes from America's founding fathers, and then quotes from himself all mixed in together. And he would pass out these quotes in the brochures to thousands of people. And so he did that by himself. And then eventually, as we got older, he assigned us all instruments. And so we all had to play with him. And so all 10 of us had this little family orchestra. So I was assigned the violin and the oboe, and then we all sang together. So I did that as a willing participant for a long time until that moment where I was just like, wow, I'm not physically safe. And I'm 17. I'm going to graduate from high school. Like, what's my future? And I have 4 older brothers, and I'm the first girl, but I ended up being the first to leave. So my 4 older brothers were still at home. There was the oldest who has schizophrenia, and then the other 3 who were still believing at that time that he had this call. And so I went on what I call my first investigative journalism project. Is my father a prophet? And that's when I found something that really disturbed me. And that was, I found in a fiberglass trailer attached to the back of the motorhome, I found some of his writings. And it was writings that my dad had done in handwritten prophecies. And I'd never seen them in black and white in this way. And the tone and the style, he was using old school Elizabethan English, like Shakespearean or like King James Bible, these and thous. And it was his revelations, he said, from God about how to live his life. And the way that he structured them were like almost identical to Joseph Smith, the founder of Mormonism, and the way he wrote one of the books of scripture. So Mormons have 4 books of scripture. They have the King James Bible, Book of Mormon, Doctrine and Covenants, and Pearl of Great Price. The 3 of them are considered in Mormon theology to be ancient in origin, and the Doctrine and Covenants is modern in origin. And so they say that this was Joseph Smith's handwritten prophecies. And my dad had basically, I call him almost like a Walmart Joseph Smith, because we used to park the motorhome in Walmart parking lots all the time.
Yeah.
And he was less successful than Joseph Smith. So, but so I saw these Walmart Joseph Smith prophecies written down, and I was just like, my hands started to shake, and I felt shock. And I knelt down and I prayed, and I said, because at that point I was still very devout LDS, and I still very much believed in Joseph Smith as a prophet and as the founder of the LDS faith. And so that became a crossroads for me. Do I leave the LDS church or keep down this path, or like loyalty to the church or to my father? And I chose loyalty to the church. And I told my dad I wanted to go away, that I was not going to be part of the mission anymore. He raised his right hand to the square and he said, I prophesy in the name of Jesus, you'll be raped and murdered if you leave. And so at that point, it's eventually, after I got to Brigham Young University, the Mormon College, I went through my second big investigative journalism project. Do I leave the LDS church? And I, in good conscience, felt like I could not stay. And so that became my second big choice to leave. And it was very hard, both moments. But leaving home, my dad said after that my blood changed. I was no longer his daughter. I was not home all through college. And I was isolated. And in some ways, I took that as a catalyst to really get motivated to focus on my career and do well. And I would say to myself, my roommates are going crying home to mama and their teddy bears, and I'm going to work my butt off. And so before I got my first job, I got 5 journalism internships, worked really hard, and that's how I made it out.
I mean, you guys got to go ahead and grab this book, because Carrie's giving us the highlights, and there's so much more that's in there and the details. But what was your mom? We talk about that was stupid, right? And so obviously your dad is saying that's stupid, to leave. What about the other members of your family?
Yeah, they all, my mom said the same thing, that was stupid. And, she the whole time she was very supportive of him. Except for at one point, she almost divorced him when I was 10 years old. And it's not surprising that that was the only time in my life that I remember being very plugged in with her family, that her sisters were very involved in her life. And we were living in a house in Utah, and she was also very involved in my school, like in my siblings' schools, like our elementary school. She led a carnival, like the school had a carnival, which was huge to have my mom actually plan a carnival for the school. Like that was revolutionary for me. And so the more contact she had with the outside world, the more she felt her sense of her own autonomy, and just strength away from this. And so she almost left him. Then she got into the car, tried to turn the car on, and the ignition wouldn't start. And she took that as a sign from God that she needed to stay. And ignoring the fact that the car had not started many other times, and the motorhome had not started many times. And, unfortunately, we were done in. And so she is very much, a believer even still that what happened was correct, and that it was God's will. So she doesn't dispute my count in the book. She just disputes that it's God's will. And that's where I had to wrestle with, because she's also a very, very nurturing person. But to wrestle with that light and the darkness that is in each of us, that at some point you become both a victim and an enabler. And when you are an enabler of enabling child abuse, then you actually become an abuser as well. And it was hard for me to reconcile that, because I had always thought of her as a victim only and not also an enabler, which is basically an abuser as well. And that's what's interesting, is that it came into stark relief recently. There was a case out in Utah with similar situation, details different. They weren't in a motorhome, but it's with this YouTuber named Ruby Frank. She had millions of followers, and she and this other woman were sentenced to 30 years in prison. And what was interesting is they both got the same sentence, 30 years, because she was the mother of the 2 kids who were abused. And the other one was, she considered herself basically like a female prophet, came in, seduced this YouTube mom, to abuse the kids in the name of God, in the name of their interpretation of LDS theology. Similar details with that. And I was very glad to see that Utah threw the book at them, because, and they even said, in their prosecution, this was a religiously motivated abuse. So I thought it was very telling that they both had equally the same culpability in the eyes of the law. And I think that with my parents, to be an enabler, you don't realize it, that when you have children who have a narcissistic parent and you are the enabler of that, you are an abuser. And it hurts me to say that about my mom, but at the same time, I had to come to reality with that in order to, in some ways, not perpetuate that myself, because I had the tendency to date abusers. And then to realize I would be passing that down, that trauma down, and that behavior down. And the thing is, like, there's a book out that just came out recently, right around the same time as mine, called Bad Therapy. You might not have heard about it, by this woman named Abigail Shrier, who's a former Wall Street Journal writer. And she's very, very critical of the therapy industry. And I think she does some great reporting. And she does call out a lot of, like, our schools are being taken over by what's known as social emotional learning, SEL. And it's teaching elementary kids to date their parents and to view everything as trauma and to over traumatize yourself. But she does put in her author's note on the first page, there are children who do need mental health care and they need support. This book is not about them. And so I think it is a fine line, because we as a society, we've created a generation, Gen Z, that is the most depressed, the most anxious, the most over-medicated generation in U.S. history. And this is troubling. So it's interesting, because I do hear from some conservatives, like, oh, yeah, there is no such thing as therapy. I had somebody tell me that, a conservative activist, or there's no such thing as mental health, So again, as in life, in everything, there is a balance. But in my case, I describe the way I got out of my own anxiety and PTSD and depression and suicidal ideation, call it a combination of prayer and therapy, prayer repeat together.
Yeah. And, what I talk about in my book and my writings is, listen, I tell people, and this was kind of my response to that pastor that we were talking about earlier, is the world wants to say that mental health issues are only physical. And there are yet some other people, then, the pastor we talk about, they want to say they're only spiritual, but they're both, right? Like it's both. And in fact, some of the early heresies of the Christian church were those who said that we were only spiritual beings, right? Like that was considered a heresy, right? And so I think we need to take this approach of, like, we are human. Yes, we have spiritual issues. And what I tell people is, like, I wear glasses. And it's like, if you told me to read your book, Carrie, without my glasses, I'd be like, well, I guess I'm just going to have to, try to absorb it through my head. No, I can't read it. Right. My physical glasses help me read and absorb what's going on. Just like my medication helps me get to the spiritual issues. I know I have spiritual issues. I have pride issues. I have control issues. I have all those things. I get it. Right. But if my anxiety level is at an 8 normally, and my medication brings it down to a 4, at an 8, I can't do, it's popular to say now, I can't do the work, the emotional work, the spiritual work, right? But at a 4, yeah, I can read the Gospel of John. I can read, Acts, and I can glean that information. So I'm glad to hear you say that about, I think I'd like to, the question that I think is burning in my mind, in the audience's mind, and again, go get the book Motorhome Prophecies to get the more in-depth version, but is, the second, that was stupid moment would be when you left the entire LDS church, right? So now you don't just have your parents saying, what are you doing? The community that you've known for your whole life is saying, what are you doing? So what was that experience like?
Yeah, it was really traumatizing. It really was. And in fact, that was actually the first time in my life I ever felt suicidal, was when I decided to leave the LDS church. And it was very hard for me, because it was a physical change. I could feel the chemistry of my brain different. I could feel different rushings. I mean, when you have chemical imbalance and you are severely depressed, the chemistry of your brain, the physical aspects are different.
Yes.
And no matter what I did, I tried jogging, I tried all kinds of, spiritual practice, and it wasn't causing the chemistry to right itself naturally.
Yes.
And at the time, I was in a study abroad in London, and I had fantasized about throwing myself in front of the tube, which is the subway system there, because I'd rather be dead than the LDS church not be true, and I had people say, oh, I actually was dating a guy, and he said, you just want to leave because you want to look at pornography all day. And I was like, that's very telling that you're saying
What?
this. Like, I've never even looked at porn. I still have never looked at porn in my life. Like, no.
Projecting much?
Exactly. And I was like, no, I actually don't want to, but I cannot in good conscience. It was like a shock to me that the things that I found and the way that the church had been hiding things and not sharing them about the founder and things he had done. And then just more about the theology of the afterlife with polygamy, and because they stopped polygamy here on earth, but they do believe the heaven is polygamous. And as a woman, I just found that I even said to the guy, I was like, how are you okay with this? Like, he's like, well, I wouldn't do it in the afterlife. I was like, how do I know that? Like, how do I have a guarantee, And so I said, it's just not fair. And I joked that I was going to start my own religion and call it More Men, where I could have multiple husbands, and just unfair that I couldn't do it and they could, And I don't mean to make fun of it, but
Right.
And there is polygamy in the Old Testament, but it's not something that, and that's what's interesting, is that it was allowed, but it wasn't sanctioned by God. I think that's an important distinction that's lost. And then obviously now with Christ and the understanding is one spouse, one wife. But yeah, I think the idea that I wanted to leave because I wanted to party and do drugs and drink a bunch, that really was not my motivation. In fact, I don't even drink now. And I drank for a while, but then I was like, I don't need this. I'm already an extrovert. Like I don't, the only thing that I get is extra calories and sugar, and it goes straight to my chin. So I'm like, I don't need this. I don't need the extra rolls around my stomach. And so I don't drink. And also the more I've learned about it, it's actually very good to not drink, because it actually decomposes your cells, and it's bad for your brain, and they're just way better things to do with your time. But in any case, I actually have a wine rack, and I have alcohol in my home that I serve to friends. So I'm not anti-drinking for its own sake. But I left the LDS church because I felt that I could no longer, in good conscience, believe the theology. And I also felt like I'd been lied to, and that a lot of things have been covered up. And I did not want it to be true, because at that point, it was my stabilizing force. It was what had protected me and been a shield for me when I left home. It was a home away from home for me after being disowned. And so it was hard. It was really hard, especially because my ancestors helped to found the LDS church. A friend of mine is the granddaughter of Pat Robertson. And I said, what your father did for evangelicalism, my ancestors did in some respects for Mormonism. Like my great grandmother saved the life of the third prophet. She was a self-trained surgeon on the Mormon trail. She delivered thousands of Mormon babies. She was the one who, when Joseph Smith, the founder, was shot and he died, there was another man in the prison with him named John Taylor, and John Taylor was shot also. And he called for my ancestor to nurse him back to life, and she did. And he became the third prophet after Brigham Young. And so I have all these family stories of not only her, but others who helped to build the church to what it is today. And so I felt a lot of guilt, because the church does some wonderful things. It's a wonderful humanitarian organization. They provide a ton of food pantry, and it's white label. Like, people don't know that it's coming from LDS. They just do it quietly, and they give it to other denominations here in the U.S., and then a lot of great international work. And I think that that's wonderful. And so culturally, there are other things that I respect about Mormonism. I think there's a lot of really great family values. Unfortunately, historically, it's been, if you left the church, then the family values went out the window. But I think they're learning to be more accepting, in part because of stories like mine. And so the idea of leaving Mormonism was like the rug was pulled out from under me, because it was my entire life plan.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to get married and have 11 children and live in a cul-de-sac because my cousins had 10 and I wanted to beat them, and here I am, I'm 41 and I'm not married and have no kids despite my best efforts. And it is what it is, And so some people would still say that was a stupid choice. But at the same time, I did experience a lot of freedom that I could live with my conscience and be able to grapple with things in a way that I could not before.
And so I think this question will in ways lead to the third "that was stupid" moment. I think what everyone is wondering, what I'm wondering, is where you hinted at this a little bit earlier with your mom, but I'd love to know, what is the relationship you have with your siblings, with your mom, and with your dad right now?
Yeah, it's really touch and go. I think even just growing up, I would joke I would have a rotating favorite brother because I have 5 brothers. And so it's like the most favored nation status. It's like, oh, you're my favorite brother right now. You're my favorite. But it ebbs and flows, and you see this with traumatized children, that hitting middle age can really, in some ways, be devastating because the trauma catches up with you. Because at that point, not only have you endured the trauma of your parents, you have self-sabotaged yourself. And now you've created your own new, freshly minted, traumatized decisions. And they're actually stupid decisions that I did. I say the book is about sabotage for my parents and sabotage for myself. And sometimes I like to quote in the Bible where Jesus says, "Who among you, if your son asks you for a fish, you would give them a snake, or if they ask for bread, you give them a stone?" Well, in my case, my dad did give me stones and he gave me snakes. And instead of dropping them, what did I do? I went out and I bought my own baskets of bread and my own baskets of snakes. And that's what self-sabotage does when you're in trauma and when you believe that the world is against you. You take everything, you go from 0 to 60, everything is sensory overload, and you have no modulation to understand when someone treats you badly, it's a reflection of who they are, or you misinterpret things to mean more than they should. And these are all symptoms of trauma. And so in the end, you end up burning bridges, you end up running away from things that are good for you, and you normalize and accept things that are bad for you. So by the time you hit middle age, it's a lot. And so to answer your question, it's a lot with my siblings because we're all struggling. And I say in the book, I don't go into too much detail for their own privacy and their own stories that they can share. But I can say we've all been struggling over the years with mental health and suicidal ideation. For the most part, there's one sibling who I'm not sure if he has or not, but I know for a fact at least 7 of the 8 of us have struggled with suicidal ideation, and it's hard. And for me, I have been able to forgive my dad. That was the decision that was, some people might say, stupid, because some people say when you forgive, that's enabling the abuser. But I make a distinction between forgiveness and reconciliation. I think there are 2 different things, and they require 2 different approaches. The forgiveness piece of it, that should be the most straightforward because it is a commandment from God. If you're a Christian, you are commanded to forgive. And even if you're not Christian, there's a lot of science. You can look it up yourself. In fact, I was just invited to join an advisory group with Harvard School of Public Health on the power of forgiveness. And as a sidebar, they've done a study sending out forgiveness curriculum and materials in 5 different war-torn countries. And they found strong relationships between forgiveness and positive mental health. So again, even if you're not Christian or you don't think of yourself as religious, trust the science. Forgiveness is good for your mental health. And God knows that, and so the forgiveness aspect is,
I like to say, I love when science kind of catches up with the Bible, right? And it's like
totally.
like God is telling us that we have to forgive, and then we're like, well, why? And then science comes and shows us why, and you're like, well, I guess we should have done it anyways.
Exactly. Yes, totally. It's for your own good. It really is. And Jesus says this, in the parable of the guy who was forgiven a huge debt by the king, and then he refuses to forgive a small debt, and then he gets thrown into prison by the king because he says, "Don't you see what I was teaching you?" And that's really for us as believers that we all need forgiveness, and that's part of the aspect of forgiving is to develop that forgiveness muscle to know not only do I need to be humble and realize I need forgiveness on a daily basis, I also need to forgive. So the practice of forgiving my dad, I talk in the book, I had a forgiveness mentor who made it a lot easier. He's a pastor down in Charleston, South Carolina. His name is Anthony Thompson, and his wife was murdered in the Charleston shooting in 2015 at that black church where the white supremacists came in and killed 9 people, including his wife, Myra. And he was able to forgive that murderer. And that was something that became the shockwave throughout the country. Because in the first bond hearing, the judge allowed the family members to speak to the accused, and they said it one after the other, "I forgive you, I forgive you, I forgive you." And this evil white supremacist guy, he was trying to spark a race riot. That was his goal. And instead of having a race riot the way we'd seen in some other cities like Baltimore and Ferguson, there was this outpouring of love. There was no rioting. There was no burning. And this was just this amazing example of love and forgiveness. And people found healing. And so my friend Anthony wrote a book about the experience. And the title is called To Forgive. And you should read that after you read Motorhome Prophecies. But yeah, and he knocks down the myths of why you shouldn't forgive. And one of them is that it's enabling or excusing the abuser. And that gets to the second piece of forgiveness. The forgiveness is a commandment. It's contingent on you releasing the debt owed to you in terms of the vengeance. And it's not to say, and it's clear that he, Anthony didn't want the guy released. He said there's a difference between vengeance and justice. So understanding that difference, I think, is important because forgiveness is not about not having the penalty that person, the abuser, needs to face, but it's about your posture of your heart toward them. And then the second piece of the forgiveness process is the reconciliation. And that is totally contingent on the behavior of the other person. That is out of your control. Forgiveness is in your control. Reconciliation is out of your control. And that's
Love that.
Something that you can be vigilant about, to be like, I'm not here to carry that burden. I'm not here to fix that person. And that happens quite often with abused women, for example. It takes the average abused woman, wife, 7 times to leave her husband. She'll go and come back. It happens 7 times before she leaves permanently. Partially because she believes it's her job to fix, or, she's the problem because the narcissist will attack her for leaving, even though he's the one who's causing significant damage. And so I do not believe that anyone is commanded to reconcile with someone if that person is not making substantial permanent changes in their behavior. And the way you realize those changes are real, that can take time sometimes. So that's, and some people will say, well, that's just a stupid choice to either forgive or reconcile. And I would say, no, I think it takes discernment on the reconciliation piece of it. But on the forgiveness piece, that's a hill I will die on, that is something that we must do.
I think that is such an important distinction. Something I'm going to take and think about, not because I have to think about if it's right, but just because dang, yeah, that's good, right? We control forgiveness. Reconciliation takes 2 to tango, if you will, to use the cliche. So you would say, have you had conversations with your dad where you've literally said, I forgive you? How have they taken this book and taken some of what you've been saying?
Yeah, so my dad has really bad Alzheimer's and he's 86. And so he's not, as I understand it, he just now spends most of his day sleeping. But there was a period 4 years ago that I describe in the book where before that, it's actually now 4.5 years because it was January 2020, right before the pandemic. Before that, for 7 years, almost 7 years, I had stopped speaking to him. So he had stopped when he disowned me. I wasn't allowed home for 5 years. He would periodically send me letters or have these really depressing phone calls with me and say how evil I was. The letters would be saying how, he said God told me you had an abortion, which was impossible because I was a virgin. And so it's like physically impossible. And, and then I spent 12 years agnostic, not believing in God, living life as a heathen. And he was very preachy and judgmental that whole time. But I didn't care because I at that point I felt like he had zero authority or credibility with me. So I didn't care anything that he had to say to me. And I just thought of him as an annoyance in my life that I had to put up with if I wanted to talk to my mom. But eventually, after he said that I tried to seduce my other schizophrenic brother to have sex, I was just like, I'm done. I am done talking with him. So I was in my early 30s and I said, cutting you out. You cut me out. I'm cutting you out now. And so for 7 years, I didn't speak to him. If I was on the phone with my mom and he tried to get on the phone, I would hang up. And that's where I lived for 7 years. And I was very angry. I had a lot of hostility toward him. Thought he was going to die before I ever spoke to him. And then a lot happened. I had my own trauma response. I had my own version of the mission. I had a company in New York that I was running. I told you a little bit about it. And I became a workaholic. And I became obsessed with this company. And it became basically everything. It became a false idol to me. And I became such a workaholic that I almost worked myself to death. And that's when I ended up in the hospital and got hypernatremia. And I was just like, after coming out of the hospital 7 times in 2019 was my COVID. That was my 2020 for me personally, from a health standpoint. And coming out of that, emerging, I had to sell the company. My life was in shambles. And I realized that part of my response in creating this business was a trauma response. It was my way of responding to trauma in a way that was unhealthy. To feel validation, to feel like, oh, I'm building this amazing company, I'm the boss, like all these grandiose things that my dad was feeling with the mission in response to his trauma. And, to be honest with myself about what I was dealing with was hard. It was a hard pill to swallow. And so that was the backdrop of deciding to forgive him. And so I went to their house. I had not spoken to him, like I said, in 7 years. And I brought my brother who I'm closest to with. He's a captain in the Army. He's very strong. So I knew I would be safe because my 2 schizophrenic brothers were there just in case. They were on their best behavior, thankfully. But I went and had dinner with them and just in their kitchen there. And it was, I didn't say the words, I forgive you, but the fact that I was there meant that I did,
Yeah.
and also I didn't want to pick a scab by being like, I forgive you for XYZ, because then it would be like,
sometimes that can backfire. I've had that backfire with like, well, what do I need to be forgiven for? And I'm like, oh shoot.
Yeah. So it was more just the presence of me being there, having the meal. He was on his best behavior. We were all on best behavior. And I was just like, wow, this is surprisingly trauma-free. And I'm just going to leave it there. And have been back to visit a few times. I did tell my mom about the book before it came out. And like I said, she was not happy about it, but she said it's God's will, what happened to us, and that I let the reader decide if it was God's will or not.
Have any of your other siblings left?
So yes, they, now at home, there's only the 2 schizophrenic brothers under their roof. So all are spread out. Some live in the area where they live and others are in other parts of the country. So it's kind of a mix, but yeah, it's hard because I think the lasting impact for us has been, a brokenness, of the 8 children, there are 0 surviving marriages. There were 3 divorces. All 3 marriages are ending in divorce. So at a success rate, that's, 0 for 8, and myself, one of the 5 who's never been married. And we have 4 grandchildren, which is not normal to have fewer typically you have more grandchildren than children, typically, not always. And it's becoming less so that way now, but to have 8 children and 4 grandchildren, that's not, especially for Mormons, that's totally out of the norm. And so I think the fruit of that has been hard. So,
So the question that I always love to end with is this. I mean, we've had several that was stupid moments, but whether it's escaping kind of under the thumb of your dad, whether it's leaving Mormonism, whether it's forgiving your dad, and then maybe even just writing a book about it, right? What do you feel like is either the overarching lesson or one of the main lessons of your kind of that was stupid stories?
Yeah, I think what's happening to our country right now is the reason why Gen Z is the most depressed, the most medicated, the most suicidal young generation ever in 250 years is because we are walking away from God. And it's not coincidental. Like I mentioned earlier, all the science shows that strong religious participation, religious community, prayer, faith community is strongly associated with less suicide, with strong mental health, with good social outcomes. But it's got to be a healthy faith. And that's what the book is about, because I swung from extreme anti-religion, hostile, I had an anti or extreme religious upbringing, and then I was hostile to religion. And I was the way that many Gen Z are today, which is hostile toward religion. And my mental health suffered because of it. So finding that healthy balance, I call it the healthy faith. That's my message of this book. That God is not religion. That God wants you to be healed. That human-run religion, I think there's a great analogy I heard from a pastor that if you hear Beethoven played badly, you don't blame Beethoven, you blame the musician. And that's what I see when religion is using God's name for evil. That is a counterfeit, and they'll have to answer for that. But you, as the responsibility for your own mental health, for future generations, for your own kids, your nieces and nephews, whoever, the strong mental health is going to come through a healthy faith.
Man, Carrie, thank you so much. I mean, I think we could talk for hours because, obviously as someone who's written a book on mental health as well, I love what you're saying, and yet what's so interesting, and this is the subject of the book I am working on now, is that even as a Christian, I had never fully dealt with the trauma of my childhood. And so, woke up last year realizing that I was an alcoholic as a Christian, as a professing Christian, as someone who, wrote a book, a Christian book, right? And yet I fell into that. And so I think even just that message that you're talking about of like, it's really important to kind of have this holistic approach towards mental health, towards us as people. That's faith-based, that's both physical and spiritual. And yet, even when we feel like, we're in the best position to get it right, like we still stumble. And so what's going to happen then, right? If you don't have that foundation and yet you still struggle. So I thank you for your, one of the pillars of kind of the process that I used to get out of my addiction was radical vulnerability. And so I really appreciate, and that's one of the things that drew me to you in the book and your story is just putting it all out there, right? Like when we put it all out there, there's just something that happens. So thank you for having the courage and the bravery and what you're doing for women, for people in the mental health community, for people who are, struggling to find out like what is true. I really appreciate that. So thanks for joining the podcast.
Thank you, John. And God bless you in this new book.
I told you that this was going to be a heavy podcast, and yet heavy but hopeful. And I think there's so much that Carrie said there about mental health. There's so much she said there about forgiveness that I think is just we need to. I think I said towards the end there that one of the things that she said about forgiveness and reconciliation, I'm just gonna have to ruminate on that a little bit, not because I don't believe it's true, but because it's just so good, and I think there's a lot of depth there. So maybe you want to even go back and listen to this episode a couple times, because I think there is some really good depth and nuggets. I just think we all have people, you can email me, I guess, but I think we all have people in our life that either at one point in time we struggle to forgive or that we need to forgive. And especially when you make that difference between forgiveness and reconciliation, I think that's really important. And it's not just as simple as saying, well, I forgive you, right? It requires a heart and a posture change. And so I would encourage you to seek the Holy Spirit on that. Listen, we appreciate you here. We appreciate you listening. Make sure to like, rate, subscribe to the podcast. Listen wherever you want to. Until next time, I'm John Seidel, and this is That Was Stupid.